Hello dear listener, please subscribe to our channel. Enjoy watching. I guess, looking back, it started with a feeling I couldn't shake. Like an itch in the back of my mind I couldn't scratch, no matter how many late nights I spent painting or how many cups of coffee I downed just to push through. Julia, my wife of 5 years, wasn't herself lately, or maybe she was, and I'd just been too wrapped up in my own little world to notice. I mean, I paint, right? That's what I do. Sometimes I'd pull 12-hour days in my studio, losing track of time, light, and even meals. Julia was used to that part of me, always supportive, saying I was the brooding artist type. We were the perfect couple, at least on the outside. But you know how it goes. The little things start to add up. Julia was home less, dressed a little nicer, always with some excuse. I didn't think much of it at first. Why would I? She was my Julia. I trusted her completely. But soon, even my gut was screaming something was off. One night, she came home a little too late, her hair still perfectly done, perfume too strong for a regular girl's night out. I asked how her night was. She gave me this little shrug, the kind you give when you're lying but don't care enough to cover it up well. That's when I knew. I didn't need a private investigator or some grand discovery. It was just her body language, her dismissive way of brushing me off. After 5 years together, that's all it took. And that was the first spark of rage in me. I played it cool, didn't let on. But inside, I was brewing a plan. Something wicked, something that would teach her that I wasn't some fool she could play. And that's where the idea started. I thought, if I'm going to paint for her, I'll make it unforgettable. So, yeah, I let her think I was none the wiser. I started spending even more time in the studio, losing myself in the details of my work, or so she thought. I painted late into the night, sketching, adjusting, perfecting every detail of her face, all for the masterpiece I planned to unveil just for her. I wanted this to be my best work yet, not just for art's sake, but because I wanted her to feel something powerful when she finally saw it. During the day, I began watching her carefully, without her noticing, tuning into all those little things that had slipped by before. She'd get messages she couldn't ignore, always with that guilty flicker in her eyes before she'd excuse herself to take the call. Some mornings, she'd hum when she thought I wasn't listening, her voice light in a way I hadn't heard in years. She was laughing more, too, whenever she thought she was alone. And it wasn't with me. The strange part? Even though I was furious, I started feeling something else. Curiosity, almost. It was like I'd been handed this twisted riddle, and each clue made it more intriguing. I mean, who was he? What was he giving her that I couldn't? But every time I felt that sting, it just fueled me more, made me sharpen the picture in my head of how I'd get back at her. So, yeah, I started building my masterpiece. I told Julia it was something special, that it would be the most intimate, vulnerable piece of art I'd ever done. She acted excited, of course, but I could tell she wasn't actually listening. Fine by me. I knew she'd be there when I wanted her to be. Every night I worked, her face became clearer in my mind, but not as I saw her in the flesh. No, in my painting, she was different. Her face had a tinge of guilt in the set of her mouth, the faintest shadow of remorse in her eyes. I exaggerated those tiny flaws, making her look almost grotesque but still beautiful, just enough to capture her essence in a way she wouldn't want to see herself. If you looked closely, you could even see tiny details, a faint outline of a man's shadow in her eye, a wisp of fabric that wasn't hers draped over her shoulder. At the same time, I started gathering the proof, as I called it. I'd come to think of it as my paintbrush. Really, each little piece was just another stroke in this revenge I was plotting. Her lover's face. Got it. His name? Yup, that too. Turns out, he was a guy from work. Adam or Alex or something like that. He looked like the sort who'd wear a suit to bed if he could, the type who'd brush his hair 3 times in the mirror before going out. When I found his picture, I added that preening little smirk of his into my painting, too. It became my private game, slipping in these little hidden touches that she'd recognize but wouldn't want to admit. The idea was to trap her in a mirror she couldn't escape. Then there were the messages. Those hurt the most, reading those sugary little nothings she'd sent him, the ones she hadn't thought to delete because I was oblivious. I spent hours reading through each one, seeing the words she used to flatter him, to lure him in. Each time, I felt like I'd taken a kick to the gut. But it only made me more determined to see this through. I started adding the words into the painting, in tiny whispers. If you got close enough, you'd see faint inscriptions, like secrets hidden just beneath the surface. Lines like "I can't wait to see you" and "he doesn't know a thing" were carefully woven into the shadows around her figure, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. I imagined her staring at it, realizing that every word she'd tried to hide was staring back at her, immortalized on that canvas. After weeks of working late and sleeping on the couch, my piece was finally ready. I stood back and took it in, really letting myself see it. There she was, Julia, staring back at me with that blend of guilt and allure, her lover's shadow barely visible in the background, her body draped in secrets only I knew. I felt a strange satisfaction. I wanted her to feel how exposed she'd made me feel, like the world could see her for what she truly was. I decided to make the reveal dramatic. It was my revenge, after all. I wanted it to hit just the right note. So I invited her to the studio one evening after she'd come home late, looking a little too happy for someone who was supposedly running errands all day. I kept my face calm, told her I was finally ready to show her the special piece I'd been working on. She looked surprised but followed me, probably figuring it would buy her some time or get her back in my good graces. I led her into the studio, keeping the lights dim. I wanted her to feel like she was stepping into something intimate, almost confessional. She moved closer, a smile starting on her lips, probably thinking it was another one of my romantic gestures. But as her eyes adjusted and she really saw it, I watched that smile freeze. It took her a few moments to process. First, the resemblance hit her. Then she noticed the details, her guilty expression, the shadow of her lover, those faint inscriptions. Her face went pale. She took a step back, and I could almost hear her heart pounding in the silence. "Max, what is this?" she whispered. "Oh, just a little portrait I made for you. I wanted to capture every part of you, you know?" I said, keeping my voice light. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Instead, her eyes darted over every inch of the painting, like she was searching for a way out. It was almost satisfying, watching her try to piece together just how much I knew, how much I had captured. She looked at me, panic flickering in her eyes. And I just stood there, waiting, letting her see how calm I was. She probably expected me to shout, to accuse her, to demand an explanation. But I just stood there, calm, because I knew the best revenge wasn't in yelling or demanding answers. It was in letting her know that her secrets were laid bare, that I'd seen everything and captured it in a way she'd never escape. And then I told her, this is just the beginning. I'm going to put this painting on display, *R* painting. Let's see how well it captures the true you. Her face drained of all color, and I finally felt the satisfaction of watching her feel the weight of what she'd done, an ending I knew she'd never see coming. Her face drained of all color, and I finally felt the satisfaction of watching her feel the weight of what she'd done, an ending I knew she'd never see coming. She stammered, trying to say something, anything to lessen the impact of what she'd just seen, but no words would come. Instead, I watched her slowly turn pale, her hand trembling as she raised it to her mouth. Julia had always been so composed, so in control. But here, in front of her sins laid bare, she was powerless. You can't show this to anyone," she whispered, barely able to speak. "You can't." "Oh, I'm not just showing it," I said, meeting her wide-eyed stare. "I'm putting it on display. I've already got a gallery space lined up for the big unveiling next week. Press, critics, a few other artists, everyone. They're going to see this, Julia. And they'll know exactly who you are." Her eyes filled with horror as she finally grasped the scope of my plan. I'd made this painting of her not only to confront her but to expose her in front of everyone who mattered. It was a public confession she couldn't avoid, a mirror she couldn't hide from. Her breaths were coming faster, and I could see the panic rising in her eyes. "Max, please, don't do this," she begged, reaching out as if to touch my arm, but I took a step back, keeping that emotional distance she couldn't cross. I made a mistake, okay? I don't know what I was thinking, but please, don't ruin my life over this." Her voice cracked, and for a second, I almost felt a twinge of pity. But then I remembered every single night I'd spent in that studio, every lie she'd told me, every time she'd laughed or hummed a tune, knowing she was betraying me. My mind was clear now, my decision was final. "You already ruined it," I replied, coolly. "And I've just finished what you started." She looked like she might fall apart then and there, tears forming in her eyes. But that's when something flickered in her expression, a sudden flash of anger I hadn't expected. "You really think anyone will care about your stupid painting?" she spat, trying to regain control. "No one's going to sit there analyzing every little detail. They'll just think you're bitter and obsessed." I chuckled, shaking my head. "Oh, they'll care, Julia. People love a good scandal, especially in the art world. And once it's unveiled, this stupid painting will be all anyone talks about. I'll make sure they know the story behind it. Trust me, they'll see every detail you thought you could keep hidden." She looked trapped, like an animal caught in headlights, and for once, I saw her without the facade, the endless charm she'd always wielded so effortlessly. Now, she was just raw and vulnerable, exactly as she'd left me. There was silence, just the hum of the studio lights and the weight of everything that lay between us. And then, without another word, she turned and walked out, her footsteps echoing against the walls as she left me standing in front of my masterpiece. The following week, the painting was unveiled at the gallery. Critics gathered, journalists buzzed with questions, and I watched, leaning casually against a wall, as people wandered up to the piece, murmuring to each other, dissecting every element. The details spoke for themselves, just as I'd planned. People whispered, raised eyebrows, and pointed out the faint inscriptions, the shadowed figure, the unmistakable guilt etched into Julia's face. She was nowhere to be seen, and neither was he. Perhaps they thought they could avoid the fallout by staying away. But by the end of the evening, whispers had turned into full conversations, and everyone knew the story. My name was buzzing in every corner of the gallery, as was hers. The piece went viral in a matter of hours. And there, standing in the gallery, listening to the endless murmurs and the shock in everyone's voices, I finally felt free. I'd told our story in a way no one could forget. It was closure, and it was all mine. If you leave a comment, tell us what you think about the story you heard. It's important to us and will help us find and tell stories that you find interesting. Thank you for watching us.